What's going on, everyone? This is Frank. Today we're working on a 2011 Kia Optima with the 6-speed manual transmission. The problem we're having is the slave cylinder blew out, and you can tell because when you press the clutch in, it sticks to the floor and it doesn't build any pressure. So once it's running, you put the clutch in and it won't take any gear, but when you turn it off, it will. Those are symptoms of a failed slave or master cylinder. But we could tell that it was the slave because you can see fluid dripping out of the transmission when you pump the clutch and build up pressure. So to replace the slave cylinder, you actually have to remove the transmission. It sits around the output shaft. So we're going to go ahead and remove the transmission, do the clutch, pressure plate, throwout bearing, the whole 9 yards. So this is a part one. All we're doing is removing some stuff that may be in the way. So we're going to remove the battery, the airbox. We already removed the air intake. And it's very simple. There's a 12mm bolt holding the battery in. The intake just has a few push pins. And it slides out from the box. To remove the top half of the airbox, you loosen a 10mm screw on the throttle body and fight it off like so. And to remove the airbox, there's only two 10mm bolts here, and that's it. While the car is on the ground and the tire is on, you want to take a 32mm socket and break the axle nut. This is best to do while the car is down. It gives you the best leverage. This one's already broken loose, so be sure to do that on both sides. Now we're removing connections off of the transmission itself. There's a tab here to move that electrical. There's a pinch tab. You'll pinch it and push it. They're very soft, so you can do it by hand. There's an electrical connection here. Tab is at the tip of my finger. Push up, pull out. You can move that wire loom. Now this is a little slide connection. There's another push tab here you want to remove first, like so. And then you can get a good grip on this and wiggle it loose. And now we have two shift cables, one here and one right there. So you're gonna want what we call a dental pick, just to wedge in there and pry off the tab. Don't lose those. You set it to the side. There's a washer, and the shift cable slides off. Out of these, it has two retainers for the cables itself, one here and there. They're a little tight, but they just pop straight out with a little wiggle, and your shift cable is disconnected on that side. Let's go ahead and do the same with this one. So the best way to get the axle out would be to remove the two bolts connecting the knuckle to the strut, which this side's a 19, this side is a 17. So they're fairly easy to remove. But doing so, you don't have to remove the tie rod end or the ball joint. It will just give you enough play on the top to remove the axle. But since we're going to be doing that, you got to remove what'll stretch, or things that won't stretch enough, excuse me. So this ABS sensor we're going to remove. It's a 12mm here, 12mm here, and the sensor is held by a 10mm right here. So just gonna remove all these. All right, so we popped the axle out. As you can see, he's holding this hub assembly with the knuckle on it. We didn't disconnect the tie rod end or ball joint. We're just stretching it. See, that cable is tight, but just be as gentle as you can. He's supporting it. Got under it and pried the axle from the transmission, and it just comes straight out. The hardest part is fighting between that sway bar link right there. It's tight, but it's definitely doable. So that's one axle out, now to the other side. A few more things before we get to the right side. So there's a ground here with a 10mm nut you're gonna remove. Here's a line that's fed to the slave cylinder. It comes right here. I used an adjustable wrench to break off this little valve. or this little screw, excuse me, to break that off. And then, see if I get a good view. There's right here, not sure if you can see that, there's two 12 millimeters that are holding a bracket on. So you're gonna remove those so you can move this line easily and get it out of your way. One thing I found out that is different from the opposite side is this bottom bolt won't clear the brake line, and the brake line has absolutely no play in it. So we're gonna have to remove this caliper, which will be two 14 millimeter bolts, one here and one right here. So we're gonna remove those, move the caliper out of the way, and get back to it. All right, we just removed the last bolt holding the knuckle to the strut. I have a jack supporting the assembly so it won't just fall or stress out the ball joint too hard. So now we've got it separated. Just gonna push the axle off, fight it off as best we can. I'll need an extension or a large screwdriver and a little more support, but once I get that holding straight up, I'm going to take a screwdriver and hammer the axle the rest of the way. We hammered it out better, so now I can force it with my hand. I'm going to try and move this to the right side. As you can see, that CV shaft has enough flex on the boot to where you can angle it out of the center of this knuckle. Or this is the hub, but anyways. So now we have the axle free. We're gonna have to get under the car and pry it from the transmission itself. All right, so now we're on the other side of the axle that connects to the transmission. Just gonna take a very large screwdriver and make a wedge against it and see it pries very easily. For clearance removing your transmission, be sure to remove this plastic bracket. It helps hold your skid plates on. It's just two 10 millimeter bolts, one here and one right there. Also, take down your skid plates, get them all out of the way. So this right here is your fill plug. This will require a 17 millimeter socket. And this right here is your drain plug. That's a 24 millimeter socket. So all you're gonna do is break that loose, drain your gear oil. You should have close to 4 quarts come out. Now we're removing bolts connecting the transmission to the engine. You can see some of the holes, like right here. That's where the end of the transmission bell housing is. They're not hard to reach. They're all 14 millimeter. Here's another transmission I have for reference. This one was a little difficult to reach. I needed a 14 millimeter wrench, but the rest of them, they all took a 1/2 inch breaker bar with a 14 millimeter short socket with no problem. I get a side view just to give you guys a better idea, but they're not difficult to reach. One more bolt holding on to the transmission, and it's located right there. It says T3 on it. The best way to reach it is, I'll just show you, is from this back area right here. So I'm gonna fight through the back and eventually get my socket on. We're going to remove a tranny mount. This is called a dog bone tranny mount. It's gonna be a 17 millimeter bolt. And you can see the mount has plenty of flex, but not enough because this transmission is gonna drop out the bottom. So now there's gonna be, see my finger, there's two 15 millimeter bolts that need to be taken out, and then this mount will come out. After getting the dog bone off, we're gonna go ahead and remove this transmission mount. It's just 3 14 millimeter bolts. So we have the engine supported with a normal floor jack and some wood. It should be just fine considering we have one motor mount left, so it just needs some help on this side because the transmission mounts are off. We also have the transmission jack partially lined up. We'll have to adjust that. But the last thing holding this transmission in is this transmission mount. All it is 3 17 millimeter bolts. Sorry, right here. These pink ones. These three 17mm bolts, you're gonna break those loose and the transmission's ready to pop out. All right, everyone, as you can see, we've successfully removed the transmission. You can see there's quite a bit of damage on our pressure plate fingers. So all we need to do is remove about 6 12mm pressure plate bolts. You're gonna wanna use an impact because if you take a breaker bar and turn it, this will turn your flywheel, so you can't get them loose. So what actually failed in my transmission was the slave cylinder / throwout bearing combination. In this car, they're actually the same part. But here's a good part I have. And you can see it's not stuck in that actuated position. And I can press it by hand. It's a little tight, but see, you can press it, closes and releases just fine. So that's a good part. To replace it, it's going to be 3 10mm bolts, one here, one there, and one right there. A little tough to see, but it's only 3. You're going to have to remove this bushing in here, get that loose, and then it pulls straight out. Now the big thing when reinstalling is make sure it's centered. So you see, for right now it's not centered, so it's actually hitting the output shaft. So you have to push it on right. See, it kind of clicked, and now it's center. Make sure you transfer your hose from your old part to your new part. There's going to be a retaining clip here that you pull out, and then move this hose off and transfer it. You may have to transfer this bushing as well, just depending on where you get your parts from. We got the flywheel back in and resurfaced. It's torqued at 94 foot-pounds of torque. We used some blue Loctite on the bolts. The pressure plate we got in, and the clutch aligned, of course. The pressure plate is torqued to 23 foot-pounds of torque. The range is, I believe, 21 to 26. So we felt right in the middle was a good spot. So everything's torqued up, everything's aligned. We're about to get the new transmission in. We lowered the engine probably 3 inches or so to allow us to get the transmission in better. We're having trouble clearing that frame rail. So now since we brought the engine down, we're hoping that it'll mate easier with the transmission. But we're about to find out. Quick update. As you can see, we have the transmission fully lined up with the engine. Got the splines lined up and meshed together. It's a tedious process. You can see there's no gap anymore. It's a tedious process. We had someone gently turn the crankshaft while my father and I put some force on this back end. And the biggest part is you have to make sure your engine and transmission are level with each other. They have to be flat on a flat plane so that output shaft can line up correctly into the engine. As a quick reference for extra things I had to remove quite a bit of bracketry here, had to remove the computer, removed the transmission mount completely. Let's see, there was a bracket that fed the shift cables. It put them in the right direction. I removed that. I had to disconnect the motor mount. I removed the motor mount because that gave us plenty of play with the motor, so I could move the motor all the way over here. And I nicked the AC lines just a little bit, but not anything dangerous. Now I'm reinstalling the stuff I took off to help me with the transmission removal. So I got the engine mount reinstalled, reinstalling the coolant bottle, have this wire loom reinstalled, and the bracket, of course. I'm putting on the tranny mount bracket, and one thing I forgot is there's a connector back here for the brake booster I have to reinstall. Don't forget that. Also, I'm about to put the computer in. So a few more things to get completed. Still getting everything buttoned up. So the computer's in, the tranny mount is in. So now since the transmission mount is in, there are these 2 bolts, one here and one here. That's a computer bracket. So make sure you tighten those 2 down, and that allows you to put this bolt in. So for the computer, it's this bolt, this nut, and this bolt. Now, if you're a more experienced mechanic, you may not need to take any of this stuff out, but as you can see, it's pretty easy to reinstall. So it's definitely better to be safe than sorry. Don't forget about the shift cable retainer. There's 1, 2, 3 bolts, and make sure you get those tight. Moving this linkage around will allow you to tighten it. Then put the shifter cable on. There's a washer and a cotter pin you'll put in. Now we're installing this dog bone mount. I call it the dog bone, not sure what other people call it. I'm missing the bracket for the transmission, so I'm gonna go locate that, but I'm just installing it on the body. So I just installed the axle. On the other side I installed the caliper, and now I'm tightening up the knuckle to strut bolts. I have this brake line attached, the ABS sensor attached, which sits right there. So it's coming together piece by piece. All right, so we have everything in except the airbox and battery box. So right now we are bleeding the slave cylinder. So my partner just got done pumping the clutch. Go ahead and hold it to the floor. So now we're bleeding it. So this is a 14mm support and a 10mm bleeder valve. So we're just gonna open it up. You see that fluid's coming out. That's what you want. Make sure it's 100% fluid, no bubbles. Right now they're still holding it to the floor, so I'm gonna shut it. All right, you can let off. All right, start pumping. And now they're gonna start pumping up the clutch again, building pressure, and we're gonna repeat the process. Just replaced the clutch. This is a test drive and it's doing really well. See, I'm downshifting to 4th, 3rd. It's biting great, it's driving great, feels like a new car. So, long story short, that's how you replace the clutch on a 2011 Kia Optima. Thanks for watching, guys.